ago and bringing goodness into the world, wildlife, wilderness, conservation, greening up the earth.
Nicknamed the Crocodile Hunter, Steve Irwin rose to international fame in the 1990s through his television series, The Crocodile Hunter. For decades, America loved him. Families tuned in week after week to watch his fearless energy, his wide grin, and his deep passion for wildlife. But behind the khaki shorts and boundless enthusiasm, there was something most people never saw. A side of Steve Irwin that stayed out of the spotlight. A truth that didn't fit the image the world had already made up its mind about. Now, years after his death, that hidden part of the story is beginning to surface. And no, it's not what you expect. So, what exactly was this dark secret? And why is the truth only coming to light decades later? Join us as we get into all the details. Before becoming the Crocodile Hunter. Steve Irwin didn't burst onto the world already shouting "Crikey" in khaki shorts. That version came later. Long before the cameras, the catchphrases, and the global obsession, his story began quietly, almost unremarkably. On 22nd February 1962, he was born in Upper Ferntree Gully, a modest suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne, to Lynn and Bob Irwin. Nothing about that day screamed destiny. No headlines. No sense that this baby would grow into one of the most recognizable wildlife figures on the planet. But the groundwork was already being laid, whether anyone realized it or not. Steve's parents weren't dreamers. They were practical, hands-on people. Bob, a former plumber, had an intense, almost consuming fascination with reptiles, especially snakes. Lynn, a maternity nurse by training, balanced that intensity with patience and care, spending her time rehabilitating injured wildlife. Between them, the Irwin household ran on discipline, curiosity, and respect for animals. Animals weren't entertainment. They weren't props. They were responsibilities. That mindset shaped Steve early, and it shaped him deeply. While other kids were taught to keep their distance, Steve leaned in. Reptiles fascinated him, especially the ones everyone else feared. Venomous snakes, sharp-toothed lizards, creatures that sent most people running. Steve didn't just observe them from afar. He chased them, sometimes even against his father's advice. There was an incident that became family legend. Steve once brought a red-bellied black snake home on a public bus, calmly carrying it in the driver's esky like it was a packed lunch. No drama, no panic. Just a boy completely unfazed by what would terrify almost anyone else. Even then, it was clear he wasn't wired like other kids. In 1970, everything shifted. The family moved north to Queensland's Sunshine Coast, and with that move came a whole new world. Steve attended Landsborough State School and later Caloundra State High School. But the classroom was never where he truly learned. His real education happened outdoors, surrounded by scales, teeth, and raw instinct. Bob and Lynn opened a small operation called the Queensland Reptile and Fauna Park. It wasn't polished, it wasn't glamorous, but it was alive. Crocodiles, snakes, reptiles everywhere. And Steve grew up in the middle of it all. He didn't just watch from the sidelines, he worked, feeding animals, cleaning enclosures, learning their habits, their moods, their warning signs. By the age of 6, he was handling a 12-foot scrub python. By 9, under his father's careful guidance, he was working with crocodiles. That same year, he wrestled his first croc. Not for applause, not as a stunt, as a lesson. Respect always came first. Fear came second. As Steve grew older, the danger grew with him. He volunteered with Queensland's East Coast Crocodile Management Program, capturing and relocating crocodiles that had wandered too close to people. More than 100 of them. Some were released back into the wild. Others ended up at the family park. It was risky, unpredictable work. But to Steve, it felt normal. It felt like purpose. By 1991, he stepped fully into the role he'd been preparing for his entire life, taking over management of the park. And in 1998, he renamed it Australia Zoo. The change wasn't cosmetic. It was a declaration. The quiet boy from Upper Fern Tree Gully wasn't just living alongside wildlife anymore. He was building something bold, something public, something the world was about to notice. But none of this came without consequence. Steve's connection to animals was real, but it was never safe. In 1984, a kangaroo nearly disemboweled him with its claws. 4 years later, a python wrapped itself around his neck and tried to squeeze the life out of him. Even those close calls didn't top his most intense encounters. His true obsession was saltwater crocodiles, though the feeling wasn't always mutual. In one interview, he reflected on a run-in where a croc nearly took his hand clean off. He survived, but the lesson stayed. He understood better than anyone that one mistake could end everything. He spoke about it openly, calmly, honestly, and still, he couldn't walk away. The fear was there. He just never let it lead. The calling was louder. The work that always came first. Steve Irwin didn't tiptoe into fame. He slammed straight into it the same way he did everything else. Head first, sleeves rolled up, already knee-deep in mud. There was no gentle introduction, no media polish. When he married Terry Irwin, they didn't disappear to a beach or a resort. Their honeymoon was spent trapping crocodiles. No downtime, no comfort. Just heat, water, and animals that could end you in seconds if you got careless. That footage wasn't meant to be a launch pad. Shot by John Stainton, it was raw and almost incidental, but it became the very first episode of The Crocodile Hunter. When it aired in Australia in 1996, it felt rough around the edges, loud, unfiltered, honest. By the time it reached North America the following year, something clicked in a much bigger way. The show didn't grow. It detonated. The United States, the UK, over 130 countries. An audience estimated at more than 500 million people. Steve's energy cut straight through the screen. Broad Australian accent, khaki shorts, arms flying, eyes locked on the animal in front of him. And that now immortal crikey. None of it felt rehearsed. None of it felt calculated. It felt like the world had been invited along while he did the work he'd always done. What people often missed was the discipline underneath the chaos. Steve didn't just grab crocodiles for television. He fundamentally changed how they were handled. He spent months in Queensland's remote wilderness, refining capture techniques that reduced harm to both humans and animals. Those methods are still used by wildlife professionals today. He was building safer systems, not thrill rides, but he never filmed it like a lecture. That authenticity mattered. It's why David Attenborough later credited Steve with opening the natural world to people who might never have cared otherwise. He spoke about how Steve made wildlife feel exciting instead of intimidating, how he invited viewers in rather than talked down to them. Steve wasn't telling people what to think. He was letting them feel it. As the years rolled on, the scale kept expanding. Animal Planet eventually closed The Crocodile Hunter with a 3-hour documentary titled Steve's Last Adventure, following him across the Himalayas, the Yangtze River, Borneo, and South Africa's Kruger National Park. By that point, Steve wasn't just a TV personality. He was a fixture, familiar, trusted, larger than the show that made him famous. But the cameras never stopped real life from happening. In 2000, Steve's mother, Lynn Irwin, died in a car accident before the show had fully turned him into a global phenomenon. When he spoke about her publicly, there was no performance in it. He described her as the most loving and nurturing person to ever bless his life. The words were simple. The weight behind them wasn't. After The Crocodile Hunter, Steve didn't slow down. If anything, he accelerated. Croc Files, The Crocodile Hunter Diaries, new breed vets. Animal Planet launched Croc Week, dedicating an entire week every June to his work and conservation messaging. In early 2006, during an appearance on The Tonight Show, Steve shared plans for a children's series built around his daughter, Bindi. That project became Bindi the Jungle Girl, released after his death. Television kept calling. In 1998, he teamed up with Mark Strickson for the 10 deadliest snakes in the world. He showed up on late-night couches. Even a FedEx commercial leaned into the danger of his work, joking about snake bites and fate without sanding down the risk. Behind all of it, Australia Zoo was quietly transforming. Under Steve's leadership, it stopped being a family park and became a global conservation hub. New developments rose. The Crocoseum, the rainforest aviary. Rescue programs expanded. Conservation foundations took shape. Steve openly talked about taking Australia Zoo overseas, even floating the idea of Las Vegas. To him, scale meant reach. Reach meant impact. Hollywood noticed too. In 2001, he appeared in Dr. Dolittle 2 alongside Eddie Murphy, playing a heightened version of himself before anyone else could. A year later came The Crocodile Hunter, Collision Course. He performed his own stunts, charging through chaos, convinced he was stopping poachers. The film divided critics, but it never betrayed who he was. Physical, messy, earnest. Steve always made room for children. In 2002, he and his family teamed up with the Wiggles for Wiggly Safari, turning Australia Zoo into a bright musical playground. He lent his voice to campaigns, fronted conservation efforts, and kept repeating the same idea in different ways. He hated preaching. He believed excitement worked better. If people fell in love with animals, they'd protect them. Conservation wasn't a side project. He called it his real mission. He bought vast stretches of land across Australia, Fiji, Vanuatu, and the United States, treating them like private national parks. To Steve, that was proof that individuals could still move the needle. He founded what became Wildlife Warriors Worldwide, helped establish International Crocodile Rescue, created the Lynn Irwin Memorial Fund in his mother's name, supported rehabilitation centers for injured wildlife. He pushed people to travel responsibly, to stop funding poaching through souvenirs and consumption. Even at the height of his fame, he stayed clear about where his inspiration came from. Terry later said that if one person truly shaped Steve's outlook, it was David Attenborough, and the respect ran both ways. Attenborough continued to point to Steve's rare ability to make people care. Through all of it, nothing shifted. Not the tone, not the priority. The work came first. The animals came first. A love that stood the test of time. Steve Irwin and Terry Irwin never looked like a love story designed for spectacle. There was no grand setup, no sweeping romance engineered for cameras. It began quietly, almost accidentally. In October 1991, Terry Raines, an American visiting Australia from Eugene, Oregon, walked into the Irwin family's modest wildlife park in Beerwah, Queensland. She wasn't searching for love. She was passing through. Steve wasn't searching either. Just 2 days earlier, he had officially taken over management of the park from his parents. His mind was on responsibility, not romance. Still, something landed immediately, cleanly, as if the decision had already been made somewhere beneath the surface. Less than a year later, on June 4, 1992, they were married in Eugene, Oregon. There was no long engagement, no drawn-out explanation. The choice felt settled long before it was spoken aloud. And what came next said everything about who they were. Instead of a honeymoon, they headed straight back into the bush to film a wildlife documentary while relocating a problem crocodile in far north Queensland. No pause, no indulgence. Work first, always. That footage became the spark. What it captured wasn't just animals or adrenaline. It caught the rhythm between them, the ease, the shared focus, the absence of fear. That documentary would go on to inspire The Crocodile Hunter, along with multiple spin-offs and the feature film The Crocodile Hunter: Collision Course. What viewers responded to wasn't performance, it was partnership. Two people moving in the same direction without needing to explain it. As the work grew, the vision sharpened. Steve and Terry renamed the expanding wildlife park Australia's Zoo, not as a branding exercise, but as a declaration. Conservation, to them, had to be loud enough to cut through indifference. Hands-on, emotional, impossible to ignore. This was never meant to be just a zoo. It was meant to change how people felt about animals. Parenthood followed naturally. Their daughter, Steve Irwin, was born on July 24, 1998. Their son, Robert Irwin, arrived on December 1, 2003. The children didn't grow up alongside the work. They grew up inside it. Cameras, animals, conservation, purpose. It was all one life. Bindi stepped into that world fully, becoming a conservationist and zookeeper at Australia Zoo, later building her own family with her husband, Chandler Powell. Robert followed the same path, working alongside his mother and sister, eventually stepping into public life himself. The legacy didn't splinter, it held. Then everything stopped. Steve died on September 4, 2006. He was just 44 years old. There was no long goodbye, no time to prepare. The loss hit all at once, and for Terry, it landed in a way that never softened. Years later, she shared openly that she had never gone on a single date since his death. Not because she was frozen in time, but because, in her words, love hadn't ended unfinished. It had completed itself. She explained that before Steve, marriage hadn't even been part of her plan. Meeting him reshaped her entire life. Nearly 2 decades later, she made it clear she wasn't searching for another chapter. She spoke about having already lived her happily ever after, about how impossible it would be to replace a man whose life involved jumping crocodiles and chasing purpose without apology. Anything else, by comparison, felt like the wrong story. In June 2025, Terry marked what would have been their 33rd wedding anniversary by sharing a photo from their wedding day. She described that moment as the first day of her happily ever after. She wrote about waking each morning surrounded by memories, carrying love forward, and committing herself to continuing Steve's legacy. The tone wasn't grief, it was gratitude. Bindi responded simply. She described her parents as true soulmates, the kind that doesn't need rewriting. Their love story never needed reinvention. It stayed exactly what it was. Complete. When the world turned on Steve Irwin. Steve Irwin was determined to raise his children the same way he had been raised, inside the world of animals, not separated from it. To him, familiarity bred respect, not recklessness. But in January 2004, that belief collided head-on with public opinion in a way that would follow him for the rest of his life. On the 2nd of January 2004, Steve stepped into a crocodile enclosure at Australia Zoo, carrying his 1-month-old son, Robert Irwin, while hand-feeding a chicken carcass to a 3.8-meter saltwater crocodile. To Steve, the moment was brief, controlled, and routine. He had grown up around crocodiles. He trusted his judgment. But once the footage aired, it stopped being just a moment. It became an image, and that image took on a life of its own. From certain angles, the baby appeared dangerously close to the crocodile, close enough for outrage to ignite almost instantly. The press moved fast, drawing comparisons to Michael Jackson dangling his infant son from a hotel balcony in Germany. Child welfare groups weighed in. Animal rights organizations followed. Even longtime viewers accused Steve of crossing a line, with some framing the incident as something far more serious than poor judgment. Steve responded publicly on Today, offering an apology while standing firm on one point. He explained that the situation had been fully under control, shaped by a lifetime of experience working with crocodiles since childhood, not impulse or showmanship. To reinforce that, he later released footage shot from another angle, revealing that the distance between Robert and the crocodile was far greater than it appeared in the original clip. Terry echoed the same message. She explained that their son had been in no more danger than a baby, learning to swim under close supervision. No charges were filed. According to one journalist, Steve told officials he would not repeat the action. Still, the fallout lingered. The Queensland government went on to change its crocodile handling laws, banning children and untrained adults from entering crocodile enclosures. The moment had left its mark. It also didn't come out of nowhere. Steve's entire television career had been built on proximity. He closed distances others avoided. He grappled with crocodiles, lifted snakes into frame, and stepped into spaces most people were taught to fear. He believed education was the only real path to conservation, and that excitement was the most effective teacher. Groups like PETA argued that his shows thrilled audiences at the expense of animals. Others saw something very different. Wildlife conservationist and television presenter Annika Svenska took a more nuanced view. She acknowledged that Steve's hands-on approach would likely be criticized far more harshly today. But she also pointed out that, at the time, it inspired an entire generation of children to care about animals rather than fear them. That sentiment echoed loudly online, where many defended Steve not as reckless, but as transformative. After Steve's death, the debate hardened. The Guardian published an opinion piece by Germaine Greer arguing that the animals had finally taken their revenge. She wrote that Steve never seemed to understand that animals needed space, that there was no habitat too fragile or finely balanced for him to barge into, and no animal he wasn't prepared to manhandle. She claimed every creature brought before the camera appeared distressed. What that assessment ignored was context. Many of the animals Steve worked with lived at Australia Zoo, a controlled environment his family built, owned, and operated. Annika didn't dismiss the criticism entirely, but she insisted it needed balance. She explained that she personally avoided touching wild animals because familiarity could put them at risk once they became too tame. Even with rescued wolves, she kept her distance in the wild. For her, the difference mattered. Animals in parks accustomed to human presence weren't the same as animals chased down and handled in the wild. That line, she said, was where the real concern lived. The same tension surfaced again in 2004 when Steve was accused of breaking wildlife laws while filming in Antarctica. Promotional material for his documentary Icebreaker claimed he slid down hillsides with penguins, came dangerously close to leopard seals, and spent time with friendly humpback whales. An investigation followed. He was cleared of any wrongdoing. Still, none of those moments stuck the way the earlier image did. What endured was the picture burned into public memory. Steve Irwin inside a crocodile enclosure, a dead chicken in one hand, his 1-month-old son in the other. Headlines branded him reckless. Investigations followed. Questions about workplace safety circled. It became his most controversial moment, whether he agreed with that label or not. And yet, even after weighing the good and the bad, Annika described herself as a fan. Like many others, she remembered Steve as someone who helped people understand animals that were often dismissed as frightening or disposable. She spoke about his influence on children, on how they learned to engage with the natural world instead of shrinking from it. When everything was considered honestly, she believed one thing stood taller than the controversy. Steve Irwin had done far more good than harm. The day Steve Irwin died. On the 4th of September 2006, Steve Irwin was killed while filming on the Great Barrier Reef. He was 44 years old. He wasn't doing anything new, reckless, or experimental. He was doing the same work he had done his entire adult life. Steve was in chest-deep water, swimming as part of a documentary shoot, when he approached a stingray from behind, intending to film it gliding away. The animal, estimated to span about 2 meters, was most commonly identified as a short-tailed stingray, though some sources later suggested it may have been an Australian bull ray. In a sudden defensive reaction, the stingray lifted itself and struck repeatedly with its tail, likely mistaking Steve's shadow for that of a tiger shark. At first, Steve believed he had only suffered a punctured lung. He stayed conscious. He spoke. He understood something was wrong, but not how wrong. The stingray's barb had pierced his heart, triggering massive internal bleeding. Crew members pulled him back onto the boat and immediately began CPR, racing toward nearby Low Island. There was nothing they could do. He was pronounced dead shortly after. In the days that followed, attention quickly turned to the footage. Terry Irwin later clarified that nothing filmed on the day Steve died would ever be released. Any material showing the incident was destroyed. Cameraman Justin Lyons confirmed that footage of the attack existed, but stated clearly that he opposed its release. The documentary itself was completed weeks later by Philippe Cousteau Jr., with no reference to the moment Steve lost his life. The news spread fast, and the reaction was immediate and global. Australian Prime Minister John Howard spoke of shock and deep distress, saying the country had lost a wonderful and colourful son. Queensland Premier Peter Beattie described Steve as not only a great Queenslander, but a great Australian. Federal Parliament opened the following day with condolence speeches, and flags on the Sydney Harbour Bridge were lowered to half-mast. Across Australia, the story dominated newspapers, talkback radio, and television. In the United States, where Steve had appeared in more than 200 Discovery Network programs, tribute segments aired across Animal Planet, CNN, and major broadcast networks. At Australia Zoo, thousands of fans gathered in person, leaving flowers, candles, stuffed animals, and handwritten messages. The grounds slowly transformed into a public memorial. A private funeral service was held on the 9th of September in Caloundra for family and close friends. Later that day, Steve was buried in a private ceremony at Australia Zoo. The gravesite was kept inaccessible to the public. Offers of a state funeral were declined. His father, Bob Irwin, explained that Steve would have wanted to be remembered as an ordinary bloke, not a symbol. On the 20th of September, a public memorial was held inside the Crocodile at Australia Zoo and broadcast live across Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and parts of Asia. An estimated 300 million people watched. The service featured remarks from John Howard, from Steve's father Bob, and from his daughter, Bindi Irwin. Tributes were delivered by his closest collaborators, Wes Mannion and John Stainton. Pre-recorded messages poured in from Hugh Jackman, Cameron Diaz, Justin Timberlake, Kevin Costner, Russell Crowe, David Wenham, Kelly Ripa, and Larry King. Australian singer John Williamson performed True Blue, Steve's favorite song. In the final moments, Steve's truck was loaded with his gear and driven slowly out of the Coliseum. Staff spelled out "Crikey" in yellow flowers as the gates closed behind it. In the weeks that followed, several stingrays were found dead along Queensland beaches, their tails cut off, sparking fears of revenge killings. Authorities later noted that anglers often cut stingray tails to prevent injuries. Steve's close friend and Wildlife Warriors executive director, Michael Hornaby, publicly condemned any retaliation, stating plainly that harming animals was the last thing Steve would have wanted. That message was echoed by Bindi. In an interview, she said she loved stingrays and felt no bitterness toward them at all. Even in death, the lesson didn't change. Respect wildlife, protect it, and never mistake grief for vengeance. The cost of a life given to wildlife. After Steve Irwin's death, the family he left behind didn't just grieve. They fractured. The closest rupture came from within. Bob Irwin's relationship with his daughter-in-law, Terry Irwin, quietly collapsed under the weight of loss, control, and clashing visions for the future of the zoo Steve had given his life to. Not long after, the unthinkable happened. The man who had built Birwa Reptile Park with his own hands walked away from Australia Zoo. His resignation landed like a shockwave. When Bob spoke publicly afterward, what he chose not to say spoke louder than anything he did. He thanked the staff. He thanked the volunteers. But Terry's name was nowhere to be found. Asked why he was leaving, Bob said only that he felt it was better for everybody concerned, adding that he had a very different sort of opinion. He didn't elaborate, he didn't soften it, and he didn't look back. Without Steve acting as the bridge, the distance between the remaining family members only widened. In 2021, Bindi Irwin reignited the tension with a public accusation that stunned supporters. She claimed her grandfather had shown no interest in her or her family, describing a relationship so cold that gifts she sent were returned after being opened. The words cut deep, especially coming from the child Steve had adored. But the story didn't land the same way for everyone. Bob's close friend and biographer, Amanda French, immediately pushed back. She insisted Bob never received anything from Bindi at all. And if he could send one message to his granddaughter, she said, it would be simple and unwavering, that she had always been welcome, and always would be. The family that once wrestled crocodiles side by side were now locked in a far messier struggle, one with no clear winner. Ironically, there wasn't much to fight over. For all of Steve's global fame, television success, and cultural impact, his life insurance policy amounted to just $200,000. Terry later revealed how stark the reality was after his death. That money couldn't even cover half of 1 week's payroll at the zoo. The truth was jarring, but for those who knew Steve, it made perfect sense. He had never chased money. He chased animals. Every dollar he earned went straight back into Australia Zoo and conservation work. While other celebrities built empires, Steve built habitats. His accounts stayed thin because his priorities were clear. Wildlife first. Always. And even after death, recognition kept finding him. In April 2018, Steve became the first conservationist ever awarded a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Science honored him too. In 2009, researchers discovered a new Australian air-breathing land snail and named it Crikey Steve Irwin. That same year, he was inducted into the Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame for his international impact on conservation. But the people closest to him knew his real legacy had nothing to do with awards. Terry later explained what truly motivated her husband. She said the only thing that could ever pull Steve away from the animals he loved was the people he loved even more. Despite the danger, the fame, and the endless work, Steve hoped to be remembered for one thing above all else: being a good father. Were you ever a fan of Steve Irwin? And do you think his death could have been completely avoided? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And click the next video on your screen. You'll enjoy it.